Within 1 hour of liberating Dachau concentration camp, American soldiers committed what is technically classified as a war crime. They lined up 50 surrendering SS guards against a brick wall and executed them with sustained machine gun fire. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It was deliberate revenge, and the man who ordered it was never punished. In fact, his superior officer, General George S. Patton, dismissed all charges and buried the investigation. This is the story of the coalyard incident at Dachau, and it's going to make you ask yourself the hardest question in war. If you had seen what those American soldiers saw that morning, would you have pulled the trigger? April 29th, 1945. A Sunday. The war in Europe was almost over. Hitler would be dead in 2 days, but the men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, didn't know that yet. They were pushing toward a large complex near Munich. Intelligence told them it might be a supply depot, maybe a factory, possibly a prisoner of war camp. They had absolutely no idea they were about to walk into something that would break them. The first sign was the smell. About a mile out, soldiers started noticing it. A sweet, rotten, overpowering stench that made grown men gag. Some of them had fought in Italy. They had fought in France. They knew what death smelled like. But this was different. This was death on an industrial scale. Then they reached the railroad siding outside the complex. There was a train sitting there, 39 cattle cars, silent and motionless. The doors were closed. A lieutenant named William Walsh approached the first car. He pulled open the door and immediately vomited. Inside were bodies, stacked like firewood. Men, women, children, skeletons with skin stretched over bones. Many had bite marks because the living had tried to eat the dead to survive the journey. The train had been sitting there for days. The SS guards had simply abandoned it. 2,310 people had been locked in those cars with no food, no water, and left to die of thirst and exposure in the spring sun. The American soldiers were veterans. These were not kids fresh out of boot camp. They had seen friends blown apart by artillery. They had seen comrades burn alive in tanks, but they had never seen anything like this. One soldier, a 19-year-old farm boy from Oklahoma, sat down in the dirt and started crying. He could not stop. Another soldier just stared at the train in silence. His jaw was locked. His hands were shaking. A sergeant later wrote home saying he thought he had seen the worst war had to offer in Anzio. He said he was wrong, but for most of them, the sadness did not last long. It transformed into something else, something primal. Rage. A cold, shaking, murderous rage. They could see the SS watchtowers in the distance. They could see the camp. And in that moment, the Geneva Convention stopped mattering. The rules of war evaporated. The only thing that mattered was making someone pay for what they had just seen. If stories like this interest you, subscribe. This channel digs up the incidents they tried to bury. Now let me tell you what happened next. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks was the battalion commander on the ground. He was a professional officer. He'd been with the 45th since North Africa. He believed in military discipline. He believed in the rule of law. But when he saw that train, even he later admitted something inside him changed. He tried to keep his men focused. He shouted orders. Keep moving. Don't look at the train. Clear the camp. But you couldn't not look. The death train was right there, 2,310 corpses staring at them with hollow eyes. The soldiers moved toward the main gate. The camp commandant, Martin Weiss, had already fled. But he'd left behind about 500 SS guards under a young officer named Heinrich Wicker. Wicker wanted to surrender properly. He put on his dress uniform, polished his boots, and found a white flag. He thought following protocol would get him treated as a prisoner of war under international law. He walked out to meet the Americans. Clean, well-fed, arrogant. He saluted and announced in accented English that he was surrendering the camp to the United States Army. He expected to be saluted back. An American officer looked at this Nazi in his pressed uniform. Then he looked past him at the smoke rising from the crematorium, at the piles of corpses, at the walking skeletons pressing against the wire. The officer did not salute. He spit in Wicker's face. The Americans entered the camp, and that is when it became chaos. 30,000 prisoners saw the American uniforms. They rushed the fences. They were screaming, crying, laughing. Some collapsed from the effort of running. They were grabbing at the soldiers, kissing their hands, thanking God. The Americans had never seen anything like it. These were not soldiers. They were corpses that could still move, living skeletons with numbers tattooed on their arms. Many weighed less than 80 pounds. But while the prisoners celebrated liberation, some of the American soldiers were hunting. They were looking for SS guards, and they were finding them. Near the coalyard, a group of SS men tried to surrender. There were about 50 of them. They had taken off their SS insignia and tried to blend in. But you could tell who they were. They were healthy, well-fed. Their skin was not gray. Their eyes were not sunken. They raised their hands above their heads. They were shouting in broken English. Hitler kaput. Hitler finished. We surrender. They thought those magic words would save them. They thought if they denounced Hitler, if they followed the rules, the Americans would take them prisoner and ship them to a POW camp somewhere safe. They were wrong. The Americans were lining them up against a brick wall in the coalyard. The SS men were starting to panic now. They could see it in the soldiers' faces. They could see the hatred. One of them started shouting about the Geneva Convention. Another was crying. There are conflicting accounts about who gave the order. Most historians believe it was Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Native American officer from Oklahoma. But some say no order was given at all. One soldier, a machine gunner they called Bird Eye, set up his .30 caliber M1919 Browning on a tripod. The distinctive sound of heavy metal locking into place. He fed the ammunition belt. He aimed at the line of SS guards standing against the wall. He looked at his lieutenant for confirmation. The lieutenant nodded. No words, just a nod. Bird Eye opened fire. The sound was deafening in the enclosed coalyard. A sustained burst. 10 seconds of continuous fire. The noise echoed off the brick walls. Spent brass casings rang as they hit the concrete. When the smoke cleared, the SS guards were on the ground. Most were dead. Some were still moving, twitching. The coal dust in the yard mixed with the blood, turning the ground into black and red mud. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks heard the shooting from across the camp. He came running. By the time he got there, American soldiers were standing over the pile of bodies, firing single shots into anyone still moving. Sparks pulled out his pistol and fired it into the air. The sharp crack of a .45 ACP. "Stop it!" he screamed. "Stop it! What the hell are you doing?" The machine gunner, Bird Eye, turned to look at his commander. His face was wet. He was crying, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Colonel, they deserved it. Have you seen what's in there? Have you seen the ovens? The bodies stacked like wood? They deserved every goddamn bullet." Sparks wanted to court-martial him on the spot, but he'd seen the death train too. He'd seen the crematorium. He'd walked through the barracks where typhus victims lay dying in their own filth. 3 men to a bunk designed for one. And he knew that if he'd been the one behind that machine gun instead of commanding from behind, he might have done the same thing. That wasn't the only execution that day. It was happening all over Dachau. At Tower B, SS guards climbed down from their post with their hands up. They never made it to the ground. American soldiers shot them off the ladder. The bodies fell into the moat surrounding the camp. Then the Americans walked to the edge of that moat and emptied their magazines into the water just to make sure. One GI later wrote home about it. He said it wasn't combat. It was an execution. And he said he didn't feel a thing. He said after what he saw in those boxcars, those men weren't human to him anymore. But the Americans weren't the only ones killing SS guards that day. The prisoners wanted their turn. Somehow they had gotten out of the barracks. They were weak, starving, could barely walk. But they had adrenaline now. They had rage that had been building for years. They found an SS guard hiding in a storage room. They dragged him out into the open. They didn't have guns. They had shovels, rocks, sticks, their bare hands. American soldiers stood nearby, smoking cigarettes, watching. One young lieutenant asked his sergeant if they should intervene, stop them. The sergeant took a long drag on his cigarette. He looked at the walking skeletons beating a man to death. He looked at the crematorium still smoking in the distance. He shook his head. No, he said. Let them finish. The prisoners beat that guard until there was nothing recognizable left. In another part of the camp, the prisoners found a capo, a prisoner who had collaborated with the Nazis, who had beaten other prisoners, who had sent men to the gas chambers to save his own skin. They drowned him in a latrine pit. They held him under until he stopped struggling. For about an hour, Dachau was lawless. The victims became the judges, the juries, and the executioners, and the United States Army turned a blind eye. Eventually, Sparks restored order. He locked up the surviving SS guards to protect them from his own men and from the prisoners. But the damage was done, and it could not be hidden. A Signal Corps photographer had been there. He had taken pictures. Photos of American soldiers standing over piles of dead Germans. Photos of the coalyard massacre. Photos of the execution wall still wet with blood. Within a week, an investigation team arrived, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker. He had orders from Eisenhower himself. Whitaker interviewed the soldiers. He collected the photographs. He wrote his report. The conclusion was clear. American troops had violated international law. They had committed war crimes. He recommended courts-martial for everyone involved. This was the investigation. The report went up the chain of command. It landed on General George S. Patton's desk. Patton read it. He looked at the photos of the executed SS guards. Then he looked at the photos of the death train. He looked at the gas chambers. He looked at the medical experimentation rooms. He looked at the 30,000 living corpses the Americans had found. Patton saw what the photographs showed. Patton was famous for being a strict disciplinarian. He had once slapped a soldier for having shell shock. He believed in military order above all else, but this was different. He summoned Whitaker to his office. Patton held up the investigation report and he asked, "What is this garbage?" Whitaker stood at attention, and he replied, "Sir, it is evidence of war crimes committed by American soldiers." Patton's face turned red. He threw the report on his desk. Patton said, "War crimes? You walk into a place like that. You see 2,000 dead bodies on a train. You see ovens full of human ash. And you expect my boys to follow the rule book? Hell no." Patton's decision was swift. He dismissed all charges. The investigation report was marked secret and locked in classified files where it would stay hidden for nearly 50 years. No courts-martial, no trials. The matter was closed. He told his staff there would be no trials, no courts-martial, no punishment. The SS got what they deserved, he said. Dismissed. Eisenhower agreed with Patton's decision. The Supreme Commander saw the photographs of Dachau and understood that putting American heroes on trial for killing Nazi monsters would destroy military morale. It would undermine public support for the occupation. It would give ammunition to German propaganda, so the order came down through channels. Quash the investigation. Bury it. Never speak of it again. The soldiers went home. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead returned to Oklahoma and never spoke about Dachau again. Not to his wife, not to his children. He carried it in silence until he died in 1977. The machine gunner Birdeye went back to his small town, worked at a factory, went to church on Sundays. Nobody knew what he'd done. Across America, the other soldiers tried to forget. Some succeeded. Most did not. The Dachau reprisals remain one of the most controversial moments in American military history. Neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers use it to claim moral equivalence. They say the Americans were just as bad. They committed atrocities too. But historians reject that argument completely. There's a fundamental difference between systematic genocide and a spontaneous act of revenge. The SS had spent years building an industrial murder machine. The Americans snapped for 1 hour after seeing the results of that machine. Picture what those soldiers saw. Not in a history book, but standing there. The smell of death so thick you could taste it. Skeletal hands reaching through barbed wire. Children's bodies stacked like cordwood. And then these healthy, well-fed SS guards trying to surrender as if they'd done nothing wrong. But that does not make it legal. Under the laws of war, you cannot execute surrendering enemy combatants. Period. It does not matter what they've done. It does not matter how evil they are. Once they surrender, they are protected. The Geneva Convention exists precisely for moments like this, to stop the cycle of revenge, to prevent war from descending into pure barbarism. The American soldiers at Dachau violated those laws. Technically, they were war criminals. And yet, ask yourself honestly, if you had walked past that death train, if you had seen 2,310 bodies rotting in the sun, if you had seen children who had been starved to death, if you had seen the gas chambers and the ovens and the medical experimentation tables, and then you saw the healthy, well-fed SS guards who had been running this machinery of death trying to surrender, could you have remained professional? Could you have followed the rules? One Dachau veteran put it best years later. He was in his 80s, being interviewed for a documentary. The interviewer asked if he regretted what happened at the coalyard. The old man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know it was wrong. I know we broke the law. But that day, in that place, it felt like the only right thing to do, and I'd do it again." The coalyard in Dachau still exists. You can visit it today. There is no plaque marking what happened there. No memorial for the SS guards who died against that wall. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history. The memorial at Dachau honors the 30,000 victims who suffered in the camp, but it is silent about the 50 Germans who were executed after liberation. Perhaps some stories are too complicated for memorials. For the American soldiers who were there, the memory never faded. They tried to forget the shooting, they tried to forget the rage, but they could not forget what they had seen. The death train haunted them for the rest of their lives. Some had nightmares decades later. Some became advocates for Holocaust education, using their testimony to make sure nobody could ever deny what happened. Others refused to talk about it at all. The silence was easier than trying to explain what that morning did to them. Here is the question I want you to think about. War has rules. The Geneva Convention exists for a reason. Without those rules, without that line between soldier and murderer, war becomes total chaos. Every conflict becomes genocide. So the law is clear. The American soldiers at Dachau committed a war crime, but here is the other side. Those SS guards had spent years torturing and murdering innocent people. They had turned mass murder into an industrial process. And when they finally faced consequences, when they finally stood in front of the people they'd wronged, they got exactly what they'd given to countless others. So I'm asking you, not what the law says, not what the textbook answer is. I'm asking what you would have actually done. If you'd seen that train, if you'd smelled the ovens, if you'd walked through those barracks, and then you saw the men responsible standing there trying to surrender. Would you have taken them prisoner, or would you have nodded to the machine gunner? Be honest with yourself, and let me know in the comments. Because this isn't just history. This is a question about human nature, about revenge, about justice, about where the line is between soldier and executioner. And it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, which is exactly why the debate still rages 80 years later, and why it probably always will.